On February 24th, 1978, five friends drove to watch a basketball game in California. They laughed together, they cheered during the game, and when it ended, they stopped at a store to buy snacks for the drive home. Everything about that night seemed normal, but the five men never returned home. 3 days later, their car was found abandoned on a remote mountain road, more than 70 kilometers in the wrong direction. It wasn't damaged, it wasn't stuck, and the engine still worked, for reasons no one could explain. All five men had left the car and walked into the freezing wilderness. What happened next would become one of the strangest mysteries in American history. This is the story of the Yuba County Five. The five men were close friends from Yuba County, California. Their names were Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, Ted Weher, Jackie Huet, and Gary Matthias. They all shared a love for basketball game. Some said it was more than a hobby. It was a passion that connected them. The night before the disappearance, they were so excited about the tournament the next day that they had already laid out their uniforms and gear at home. Friends and family remembered them laughing together, joking about who would score the most points, and making plans for the weekend. Nothing seemed wrong. Everything about that evening was ordinary, even comforting. That night, they piled into Jack's car and began their hour-long drive to the city of Chico. The road was quiet, the air crisp and cold, and the city lights twinkled in the distance as they approached the arena. Inside the car, there was a familiar chatter of friends, stories, laughter, and the occasional teasing remark. The game itself was exciting. The men cheered loudly, high-fiving strangers who shared their enthusiasm. By the time the game ended, it was late, but they were still full of energy. On the way home, they stopped at a small convenience store, a routine they had done many times before. Witnesses remembered them browsing the aisle, picking up snacks, chocolate milk, soda, candy bars, and chatting casually with the clerk. Back in the car, the engine hummed softly as they began the drive home. The night was calm. Snow had not yet fallen, but a chill lingered in the air. Their headlights cut through the darkness as they followed the familiar roads back to Yuba City. But somewhere during that drive, something shifted. A subtle change that no one could explain. Instead of heading south toward home, the car slowly veered northeast, climbing into the shadowed mountains. The familiar roads disappeared behind them. The lights of civilization faded. Trees loomed taller and darker along the roadside. The mountains grew steeper, the air colder, and the silence more oppressive. No one inside the car said much. Perhaps they thought they had taken a wrong turn. Perhaps they trusted the driver. But whatever it was, the path they followed led them deeper into the wilderness, into a place none of them had any reason to be. By the time the car finally stopped that night, something had already changed. The normal, carefree night they had started with had slipped quietly into something they could never have imagined. 3 days later, searchers finally made a discovery. The man's car was found abandoned on a narrow, winding mountain road inside Plumas National Forest. From the very first glance, the location puzzled investigators. The road was remote, barely more than a rough track carved into the side of the mountain. Cold winds swept through the trees, and patches of frost clung to the rocks. The area was completely isolated. There were no houses nearby, no passing cars, no civilization for miles. To reach that spot, the men would have had to drive deep into the mountains, far off the road they should have taken home. The detour made no sense. It was as if they had purposely chosen to leave the safety of familiar roads behind. But even stranger than the location was the state of the car itself. It was perfectly intact, not a single scratch on the body, no signs of a collision, no evidence of a struggle, no footprints around the vehicle except for their own. Even though snow had begun to dust the road, the car was not stuck in the mud or ice. Investigators later confirmed that the vehicle could have been driven away with ease. Inside the car, everything looked ordinary. The leftover snack wrappers from the convenience store were still scattered across the seats. Programs from the basketball game were stacked neatly on the passenger side, and Jack Madruga's wallet remained in its usual spot. Even the temperature inside the car suggested nothing had gone terribly wrong. The heater had been left on. Coffee cups still held traces of warmth. Yet somehow, all 5 men had abandoned the safety of the car. They had left behind a perfectly good vehicle. They had left behind warmth. They had left behind familiarity. And they had stepped into freezing temperatures, into deep snow, into a dark wilderness where no one could hear their cries. No one would have guessed that a simple road trip home could turn into one of the most baffling disappearances in American history. Every step they took in those mountains was a step away from safety and into a mystery that would puzzle the world for decades to come. The Sierra Nevada mountains in February are beautiful and deadly. That night, the air was sharp and bitter. Temperatures plunked for below freezing. Snow lay thick on the ground, crunching underfoot with every step. The wind cut through the trees, howling in the canyons and rattling branches against the frozen rocks. The terrain was steep, rugged, and unforgiving. Slopes dropped into dark ravines, and the forest seemed endless, filled with cold shadows and silent trees. Visibility was low, and every path forward was uncertain. None of the men were prepared. They had light jackets. Some were even wearing sneakers. No gloves, no hats, no winter survival gear. Not a single emergency item. They were ordinary young men, not trained for this kind of wilderness. Yet, investigators later concluded that the group walked nearly 20 kilometers into the mountains. How they navigated the snow, the cold, and the steep terrain is still a question that haunts those who study the case. Search teams poured over the area for months. Helicopters combed the skies. Volunteers trudged through the deep snow, scanning every slope and ravine. They called out names into the wind, their voices swallowed by the vast forest, but the mountains remained silent. It was as if the wilderness had swallowed the man whole. Then, 4 months later, the mystery took a darker, more unsettling turn. In June of 1978, a group of motorcyclists exploring the forest stumbled upon something unusual. Hidden among the dense trees, half buried by undergrowth and shadows, was a small US Forest Service trailer. At first, it looked abandoned, a simple structure, isolated, sitting quietly among the towering pines. But when the group stepped inside, they were met with a scene that would send shockwaves through investigators. Inside, they found evidence of life and death. Something was horribly, inexplicably wrong, because what they discovered inside the trailer was unlike anything anyone expected. Inside a small Forest Service trailer, investigators made a chilling discovery: the body of Ted Weher. He had died from starvation. At first glance, it seemed like a simple tragedy, but the scene inside the trailer told a far stranger story. Because the shelter was not empty, it was stocked with everything a person could need to survive. Military food rations, carefully packed and untouched, canned goods and unopened and still heavy in their containers, blankets neatly folded, matches waiting to light a fire. There was enough food and supplies to keep all 5 men alive for months, yet almost none of it had been used. The heater inside the trailer had never been turned on. Many of the food containers were still sealed, some showing no sign of having been moved. Ted himself had been wrapped carefully in blankets, as if someone, or perhaps even he himself at some point, had tried to keep warm. But it had been too little, too late. Outside the trailer, the search revealed even more disturbing details. One man was found along a mountain trail, half buried in snow and ice. Another was discovered miles away, far from the trailer, as if he had wandered aimlessly into the wilderness. It seemed the man had slowly succumbed while trying and failing to survive in the harsh mountains. But the most haunting detail remained. When investigators counted the victims, they realized something terrifying. Only 4 men had been found. The 5th man, Gary Matthias, had vanished entirely. No trace of him was ever discovered. No body, no belongings, no footprints beyond what the others had left. It was as if he had simply disappeared into the wilderness, leaving behind only questions. Questions that still linger today. Why did they leave the safety of the car? Why did they ignore the supplies that could have saved their lives? And what could have happened to the man who vanished without a trace? The mountains had taken them, but they had left behind a mystery, one of the strangest, most haunting disappearances in American history. And even now, decades later, the fate of the Yuba City Five remains unknown, and the silence of the Sierra Nevada continues to echo their story. Theories. In the years that followed, investigators and researchers tried to understand what might have happened that night. But the more they examined the evidence, the more confusing the story became. One theory suggests the men simply got lost. Perhaps they took a wrong turn while driving home. Perhaps they have tried to find another road back down the mountain. But this explanation leaves many questions. Why would they drive so far into the mountains in the first place? And why would they abandon a perfectly working car? Another theory focuses on Gary Matthias. Gary was the only one in the group with military experience. He had served in the US Army and had some training in wilderness survival. But Gary also struggled with mental illness, including schizophrenia. He was taking medication that helped keep his condition stable. Some investigators believe Gary may have had an episode that night. If that happened, he may have convinced the others to follow him into the mountains, believing he knew where they were going. But even this theory does not explain everything. If Gary had led them to the trailer, why did they not use the food? Why did they not turn on the heater? And why was Gary the only one who was never found? Another strange detail came from a witness who later contacted investigators. A man claimed that on the same night the group disappeared, his car had become stuck on the same mountain road. He said he saw flashlights moving in the darkness nearby. At first, he believed the lights belonged to the missing man, but when he called out for help, the lights suddenly disappeared. To this day, investigators cannot confirm whether that the sighting was real, or if someone else was out there in the mountains that night. The final chapter, the mystery that remains. More than 40 years have passed since that cold February night. The road where the car was found still winds through the mountains. The forest still stretches across the slopes of the Sierra Nevada, and somewhere out there, the truth may still be hidden. 5 friends left home to watch a basketball game. They laughed together, they brought snacks, and they began what should have been a simple drive home. Instead, their journey ended deep into the wilderness. 4 of them were eventually found, but the 5th man, Gary Mathias, vanished without a trace. No one knows why the men drove into the mountains. And no one knows why they abandoned the car. No one knows what truly happened during those final hours in the cold darkness. Perhaps the answer lies somewhere in the silent forest of Plumas National Forest. Or perhaps the mountains will keep their secret forever. The story of the Yuba County Five remains one of the most haunting mysteries in modern American history. And even today, the last steps those men took into the snow remain unexplained. End of case.